Assalamu alaikum. Let's try that. Assalamu alaikum. Is that better? I'll hold it up then, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'in. How is everybody doing? Alhamdulillah. To reiterate what Brother Kamran had mentioned, I'm honored to be here, and thank you all for the invitation. Happy to spend the next few hours with you, inshallah. I understand today is a relatively warm day for this time of year. Is that true? Happy for us Californians who can't stand the cold, inshallah. Alhamdulillah. So this was a pleasant surprise. I also wanted to share with you, just Brother Kamran had started a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, and really kind of paint the picture for the lectures that are coming after mine, inshallah. So first, let's start with why even do this kind of work, or where did this all come from? And I don't have time to go through kind of my own journey into this field, but certainly anyone who's interested, potentially, if we have students here with us, who's interested in maybe going into this field someday, happy to share with you a little bit about my own journey and how I got there. But some things that Brother Kamran touched on, that before I went into medicine, I was trained in the Islamic sciences, studied in Damascus, Syria, very honored and blessed to have done so while it was still possible, subhanAllah. And then life kind of took its route into medical school, and from there psychiatry, which I hadn't actually intended on. But since, mashallah, there seemed to be such a need within our community, it made sense, and having the foundational kind of Islamic training also really helped. So that will come into play a little bit more in our discussions of how the two things come together, because in my mind they're actually inseparable. Yet many people see psychiatry or psychology, particularly Western psychology or psychiatry, completely separate from the religious domain. But that is not quite so in our tradition, mashallah. We'll go through a historical understanding of from the Islamic perspective of mental illness and mental health. We'll also talk a little bit about, if we get to it, some of these other items that are listed on stigma, causes, remedies, and professional help. The Stanford Muslims and Mental Health Lab is a relatively new initiative in about the last 4 years or so. It is a formal research lab within the Stanford University School of Medicine, and there are several lines of research that run through it, one of which specifically is on the historical understandings of mental illness. And that will be what I'll touch on today, but there's about 8 or 9 other lines of research that run through there as well, mashallah. And it's a website that you can look up, and you're welcome to find it as a resource, inshallah. So let's jump in. First things first, to really understand that there's a very rich history in relation to mental health and the Muslim world. In fact, I would say, and I'm going to make this statement and be very proud of it, is that there really were some significant contributions that are not being recognized today. And unfortunately, our community largely has lost sight of that. Hence the stigma, hence the difficulty of access to mental health care within our communities. There's been a lot of hesitation to really engage in this type of therapy or care, although historically this very much was part of our heritage as Muslims. We'll explain more. So here, if you see, and if many of you, I'm sure like myself growing up, would hear about the golden ages of Islam, yes? And the great contributions to science and medicine and humanities and the rest, yes? Yes, same here. And you see here, if you look at the centuries, you can see where the peak started, right, from the advent of Islam, and the peak really going up 8th, 9th, 10th, 12th centuries to get to really a peak of this ilm or sciences that was being contributed, and then unfortunately a decline that leads up to the modern day. But then you see this little kind of coming up again in a revival, and some people feel that there is somewhat of a revival again of the Islamic sciences and of the understanding of what the historians of the past and what the scholars, of the past, were able to accomplish, and trying to do the same again now. If we look at the golden period of Islam, we see here that there are some really great contributions, and we'll talk one by one about them. How there was such an effort to engage in scholarship, to understand the communities that had come before Islam, namely the Greek and Roman heritage, and their sciences, and untake from them what made sense, filter through what didn't make sense, and then add to it what would be correct according to the Islamic lens. The second point here on the positive attitude towards mental health may surprise you, but you'll see very soon how that was very much the case. So translating the works of those before us and really encouraging us to seek knowledge and to spread knowledge, right, all the way onto China. True? And onwards and onwards. Establishment of the mental health hospitals. Now this may also come to somewhat of a surprise, but I'll have to quiz you guys and ask, where was the first mental health hospital established? And when? Any takers? Baghdad. Good. Where? When?
8th century.
8th century. Somebody has done their research, mashallah. Good. Alhamdulillah. I asked this to just last week. I was training a whole group of clinicians. None of them were Muslim, but they were being trained on how to work with Muslim patients. These are all mental health clinicians. And I asked them this exact same question, and they were all like, no clue. And when I said Baghdad, they were like, what? I'm like, there's a lot you don't know about Iraq, is there? Although people will claim they understood everything going in. And the century and the early amount of time, like the early history, right, in which these hospitals were established, just completely dumbfounds the modern clinician. Because very much this psychiatry seemed to be a modern science, as though only the West was able to accomplish this and come up with it, subhanAllah. Then we have this decline period, which is unfortunate, and explains a little bit of why our communities today were very different than the times of the golden era of Islam, why there is such heavy stigma against mental illness. The topics of beliefs and possession and the evil eye and magic and so on, which by and large we accept within the understanding of Islam, but sort of took precedence over the advances that happened in the understanding of biology, right? Understanding of medicine, understanding of the sciences. While they should have actually been together, there was instead kind of a shunning of that and a putting forward of what today we find within our communities, right? Only the imam can treat he or she who is majnoon or has any sort of mental turbulence, right? Only the imam. Whereas the approach, as you'll see very clearly, is that there was not just an only the imam. There was a very multidisciplinary approach, and I'll speak to that in a little bit, inshallah. Now we look at today, what's happening today. And here are a list of some of the efforts, institutions, journals, workings, that hopefully is kind of the peak or the start of a new era. Not necessarily completely new, but rather understanding and reviving what our noble predecessors had done before us, and contributing to it what is now considered to be the field of psychiatry and psychology, and doing a comparison and a filtering of what continues to make sense and what works for our community and what doesn't and needs to be trashed, essentially. So here, let's go in and really talk about what are these contributions that I keep referring to. Everything from learning and behavioral development, and if you look at the scholars and their writings, pay attention to the centuries that they're making these points in, right? So you have here, this understanding of the individual behavior and acquired behavior and behavioral change. Very common words if anybody's familiar with psychology literature today. This is exactly what you find in your psychology textbooks, right? But pay attention to what centuries and who's writing, right? MashaAllah. And also this idea even of things like conditioning and things that are attributed. Who is conditioning attributed to? Attributed to. Yes, Pavlov's theory, exactly. And who actually talked about it first? Can you see? Who? Ibn Sina. What century was that? Yeah. So this is the thing. If we as Muslims don't know our own tradition, and we don't know our own heritage, we haven't read our own books, we don't really understand what our scholars and what the impetus that really had them go into this field and all other fields for that matter was the very push that came from Islam of understanding everything that needs to be understood. The push for knowledge. Seek knowledge from what's the hadith? Yes. This understanding, right? The cradle to the grave. You're constantly in a pursuit of knowledge. That is the impetus of why the scholars were able to, our noble predecessors were able to get to things that today people consider to be, look at this breakthrough in science. And yet, it has already been discussed, but we as Muslims aren't any wiser, right? So this is why we have to discuss the topic of history and the connection between mental health and history in Islam. Let's also look at the whole importance of treating psychological illness, and you see here comments from Ibn Qayyim and Al-Balkhi I'll speak to actually more extensively later. But look at this. Healthy thoughts and feelings help during unexpected emotional outbursts and psychological disturbances, just as first aid medicine helps in physical emergencies. MashaAllah. Al-Balkhi is writing in the 9th and 10th centuries, right? So these concepts that today, and look at the next one, this mind-body medicine. Mind-body medicine is considered to be a very new age term. Yes? Yes. All right. Psychosomatics and so on. But look at the many, many, many scholars from our tradition that have already spoken to this point, right? In fact, Imam al-Balkhi starts his book by saying, I am writing this because the scholars of my era, he's writing in the 9th century, the scholars of my era are largely ignoring mental illness, the mental health of a person. They're focusing only on the physical health, and in fact they need to be focusing on both. So his book is called Masalih al-Abdan wal-Anfus, right? It is translated now in English as to the sustenance of the body and the soul, putting the two together. So the first half of his book he talks about physical illnesses, and then the second half on mental illnesses, chapter after chapter after chapter. Subhanallah. People who are very forward thinking, very forward. That today this concept is considered so new age, right? But this is actually our tradition. And let's take a look here at some of the other applications, right? This idea that you should be able to, and again, different scholars are quoted, but the balancing of the physical and the mental.
Just 1 second. Can we have everyone move in closer so people can continue to come in? If you could move in and move up. We still have people coming in. We want to make sure there's enough room. Sorry.
No worries. Are we all a little more settled and comfortable? Yes? Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. So I think we were saying about the contributions, right? That as you look at the different authors and the centuries in which they're contributing these points, for those who have read on modern psychology, maybe some of you are even majoring in this subject, and maybe others are taking at least a couple of intro psych courses. How many students do we actually have in the room? Okay, all right, good, actually. I would say majority here. And any studying psychology? Oh, yeah, numbers, inshallah. Any planning on making this a career? Potentially? Yeah, a couple hands? MashaAllah, all right. So, very much important for you to really understand the essence of what you, like, Khalil's, Brother Human will speak a little bit later about the model of Khalil Center that's used. And the putting together the professional licensed clinician who's fully capable of practicing here in this country, in their state, according to the laws and according to the training that's available here in the U.S. But in addition, being trained in the Islamic sciences, and not just in the Islamic sciences, but also in the understanding of what Islam had to say about mental health, right? Because until you have the marriage of the two things together, you may be trained professionally as a clinician, you may be a Muslim as well, inshallah, practicing whenever trying your best, but it does not mean that you'll fully understand how to put these two things together, right? And this is where we're talking, inshallah. Now, I'm really excited about the whole discussion on hospitals. Maybe it's because of my own medical training, I'm not sure, but I'm just really excited about this topic. So there's several slides on this, and I'm going to maybe belabor the point just a little bit. But I want to say, this idea of the Muslim hospitals, and the brother that mentioned Baghdad, 8th century, but you see here a number of hospitals that are dedicated to anybody who has any amount of mental turbulence in the Muslim world. What's even more amazing is the fact that you have an understanding that there needed to be a psychiatric ward, meaning section, within a hospital system, specifically for people who needed additional help, and they couldn't just be mixed in with everybody else. That's how it actually started. Then they were developed into standalone psychiatric institutions. But let's talk a little bit about what these institutions look like, especially in this era, okay? So now let's talk about so here is somebody who needed to be hospitalized. And then here comes the people who are going to treat them. Who do you think is treating them? What are your guesses? Sorry? Okay, we'll hold on to that one, yes. Who else? Any ideas?
Doctors.
A doctor, okay. Sorry? Muqra'in, we'll put them along with the ulama. We'll put those two together. Alright. Today when you go to the hospital, who treats you? If somebody's hospitalized, who comes and treats them? Doctor, a nurse, a therapist, depending on what they need. Okay. A physician, assistant. Right, so assistants of some sort, yes?
Dog.
Dog, pet therapy, potentially. Others? Good. Okay, he said drugs. Inshallah. Medications. Yes. Meaning the pharmacist, right? There's pharmacology involved and there's pharmacists involved. Anybody else have any other? Clergy and ulama. Good. We'll kind of put those together. And someone said that's what he was mentioning. Yes, clergy, chaplains, so on. We're also missing in today. Like if I talk about Stanford Hospital and how they really pride themselves on their interdisciplinary model. And it is a wonderful model. But you have the doctor, the nurse. You have the person who then figures out how this patient, once they're being discharged from the hospital, where they're going to go and what they need next. Who's that person called? A social worker. If there's medication involved, you need pharmacists, right? And then there is the potential to do here, or to say Stanford Hospital, probably here too, you have you can do a chaplain or clergy kind of referral, essentially. So an interdisciplinary team. And there's probably a few other people that I missed. That is exactly what you find in these mental health hospitals of the 8th, 9th, 10th, so on centuries. Are you surprised? Did you even know they existed in the first place? MashaAllah. That's what I mean. So understanding that these concepts that are now considered to be so fantastic and modern exemplary hospitals pride themselves on are actually found in our tradition. At a time when what is happening, when the Islamic Golden Age is happening, what else is happening in the world? Good. The Dark Ages. Exactly. So right across the way in Europe, in the Western world, the Dark Ages are happening when the Golden Age of Islam and Enlightenment is happening. And there's been quite a bit of literature on what happens and why you have the Golden Age of Islam, and then how the Western world gets into their Age of Enlightenment after ours. The spread of knowledge. Yes? But that's not our topic today. That'll be a different topic for a different day. MashaAllah. But you can see the forward thinking and how that then, the enlightenment, right? That starts and how it spreads over. I'm simplifying, but in general. And then do you understand what's happening in the Dark Ages to people who are considered to be mentally ill or have some mental turbulence? What's happening to them in the Dark Ages? They're imprisoned. They are burned at the stake as witches. And at best, comes to the point coming here later, they are put into monasteries. Because mental illness is understood at that period of time as being as a result of what? Why monasteries? Because they are considered to be spiritual illnesses, without an understanding that there could be a biological or genetic contribution to this. This was not yet in the picture in that time. However, in the Muslim world, that's not the case. They are actually in hospitals and understood that there is organic pathology that may be contributing to these illnesses. We're not saying that there can't be spiritual illnesses too, right? But the understanding of biology, genetics, understanding that something is passing through potentially for some heritability, and also understanding that there is organic biology here that's happening. The Muslims had that. Hence they weren't sent to the ulama, they were sent to hospitals, and the ulama would visit. So again, the team had who? The doctor, the nurse, the pharmacist, the social worker, and the religious leader, who sometimes would do qira'ah on them, would read, sometimes would advise. And let's talk about what these hospitals looked like. What does a hospital today look like? Give me a couple adjectives.
Bright.
So what is it? Bright? Someone said bright?
Sterile. Clean.
Sterile. Clean. Very clean, very sterile, absolutely. So almost to the point of being bland. So if you go to the psychiatric ward, and I'll speak to Stanford where I trained, if this is where this is where a person coming with mental turbulence would be, what does it look like? It's sterile, it's clean, yes? But if somebody really needs to calm down, what do they probably need? If someone's having a breakdown of sorts, what do they need? They need quiet, okay. Comfort. Privacy, sure. How about aesthetically, what do they need? Greenery. Somebody said greenery, foliage, absolutely. Absolutely. So when you look at the mental health hospitals of the Islamic eras, you find that they were built in places, and we have a whole paper actually coming out about Razi and how he picked the hospitals, right? And where to make sure that the air was clean, he would put out raw meat and see which place the moths came first, to figure out where the cleanest air was to build the hospital. And Razi himself has some really interesting things at Al-Hawi, which we're going to hopefully be publishing one on schizophrenia soon, inshallah, because he was so forward thinking. I think he got exactly understood what psychosis was, subhanAllah. Anyhow, the point being, here comes Al-Razi and understanding and commission to find where the best places for hospitals were. And then if you look at how the architecture of the hospitals for those who needed, for mental health patients, they are full of lavish greenery. And there are water fountains, right, in the middle. And it's written that this is because anybody who has some mental turbulence, this would help them calm down. They were also treated by what today we would call music therapy. Now, music therapy isn't your pop songs. In fact, that make you crazier. MashaAllah. Music therapy was intonations. We call this in Arabic the maqamat, understanding what tones help and soothe people. So I tell the story often, and forgive me if you've ever heard it before, but when I was training at Stanford, one day we were in the doctor's room doing our notes, and I started hearing this music coming from the hallway. And I was like, we all were sort of looking at each other like, where is this coming from? And finally put my head out to see, and there was a lady sitting in the hallway, literally the hallway, here are the patient rooms, and she's sitting in the hallway with this humongous harp. And she's just, going away at her harp. And all of us were like, oh, that's very nice sounding, but there was this worry and concern that some of our more delusional patients might say to themselves, I knew I was in heaven. MashaAllah. This kind of, and actually we had that happen, which was really ironic and funny. But this idea of even intonations, things that calm and soothe people. You mentioned pet therapy earlier, right? And pet therapy, there's very common. We'll bring dogs and people will pet them and kind of feel better. But there was an understanding of our noble predecessors that connecting people back to nature. I was commenting as we were driving here that the playgrounds were all concrete slabs, and I realized you're in the middle of New York City, mashallah. But at some point, and you have a little park and a fountain here, which is great. I can see the fountain, mashallah. But sometimes to connect back to nature, right, kind of pops you back into reality again, because you've built a bubble around you and you need to get back into the real world, right? And nature does that, which explains why the mental health hospitals looked the way they did. Now let's talk about finances. How was all of this funded? Zakat. So again, speaking to the non-Muslim clinicians when I was doing that training just a little bit ago, they were blown away. Because people are so scared, right? There's all this rhetoric from certain parties here in America of Sharia law taking over. Yes? Yet I say to myself, the last people that should be concerned about this are the mental health professionals, because they would never have to worry of how to actually have access for their patients. Because in Islam, it's so forward thinking that these hospitals, meaning that anybody that needed had any amount of mental turbulence that needed help, could go to these places for free of charge, because they were covered by zakat funds. Now, how forward thinking is a deen that earmarks funds specifically for psychological help? Yes? MashaAllah. So then we start to really understand where our scholars were coming from, our noble predecessors, our own heritage, right? And understanding that this isn't something to be scared of or something shunned and is only considered, it's too Western. Now, granted, in its current mode, it is. But that's why Muslim clinicians and those who are doing the research and the work about it that we'll be presenting are bringing a revival to what our scholars of old have said, because certainly they didn't have all these advances of science, humanities, medicine, and so on, and ignore the mind. Certainly they did not. And it shows, right, in the institutions that they built and the research that they had. And also interesting that when we talk about medical treatments for those who are mentally ill, there was also this understanding that you bring the two together, right? And that there were treatments being proposed, including, which I'll get to a little bit later, including what today we would call the pharmacology, right, all the medicine. But that was the case there too. Granted, it was herbs and such, but that's essentially the discussion of pharmacology. Now, for psychotherapy, there's some discussion as well that some of the scholars, our predecessors, were some of the first to really describe modalities of psychotherapy. Al-Balkhi, for example, and also Al-Razi, have some writings in which it is clear that they had modalities for those who are familiar with what psychotherapy is, cognitive behavioral therapy like CBT and other modalities of therapy, it's clear that the foundational principles of those therapies, he already had spoken about them and given them as remedies for certain illnesses. SubhanAllah. Look at the different types and classifications, and if you look at them, you'll see that these are the same ones that we talk about today if you were to go to a therapist, mental health clinician, counselor, etc. The same exact breakthroughs. And I say that because it is important, because the Greeks and Romans were not able to do this. And for a long time, the Western world itself was not able to do this. But in the Islamic era, you see these classifications. It's understood these are different illnesses, and they are classified and diagnosed as such. MashaAllah. How about this man? The first person it's said about him in historical texts that he was attributed to have been to talk about what today the illness we call OCD, which is what? Obsessive compulsive disorder. The first reference, not even a full clinical discussion, but yet a case, like a little snippet, is this man named Richard Burton. He's the one who's attributed, right, to discovering and talking about OCD. And the first full-on case discussion, clinical discussion, doesn't happen until the 19th century. So we have Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, who's in the 9th century, right? And if we look at his work, he does some really interesting things. He specifically writes in non-technical Arabic, saying in his introduction, I'm doing this so that the work is understood and accessible by all people. Also, as I spoke to earlier, he's separating the physical and mental health and making sure that both of them are there. And the book has been just recently translated, and so if you want to find a copy of it, it looks like this, by Malik Badri, who also spoke extensively about Balkhi. My exposure to Balkhi was actually in his original Arabic, and we were reading through the different sections of Al-Balkhi's book. It's not very big. And what was amazing to me is it was clear, this one is about depression, this is about anxiety, he's got all these wonderful chapters to the modern clinician who clearly can recognize what these are. But I got to the section on OCD, and I just was amazed. Because I had always learned in all of my medical training, this is a modern illness. It was only described and understood in the last century. Right? It's a very new understanding of this illness. But here I am reading Al-Balkhi from the 9th century, and everything he's describing sounds so much like modern day OCD. So I went to the director of our OCD clinic at Stanford, and Stanford has one of the 4 main original foundational kind of institutes on OCD. So this person I'm speaking to, who's now retired, is essentially one of the experts of the world on OCD. And I go to him, and by the way, I love this part of the story. His name is spelled Koran. Not Muslim. I say, Dr. Quran, I came across this text that describes OCD, and he says, that's nice. What point? He's a history buff. He's really into it. And he says, what era is this in? And I say, 9th century. And he says, that couldn't be. And I said, no, but really, it is. I said, but that's really the case. And he says, okay, well, let me see. I've written, and he had actually written extensively on the Greeks and Romans and early beginnings of OCD. And he said, I've never come across it. I said, it's in Arabic. He said, oh. Well, then, how about you, translator, then let us know. So I did that, and I came back, and he was just like, he was like dumbfounded, like couldn't even figure out what to do, and I'll explain to you why. Look at this. This is the DSM on one hand, the DSM, which is the Modern Statistical Manual for Psychiatry that any clinician uses to diagnose OCD. You have to meet these criteria, and a clinician has to make sure the patient has met these criteria to diagnose those. And on the other side is Al-Balkhi's criteria. What do you see? Mashallah. Point by point by point by point. Just about. So when this was submitted to mainstream medical journal, this one's published in the Journal of Affective Disorders, they were dumbfounded too. And I've never seen this happen, but they accepted the paper without anything like that immediately, which if anybody knows anything about medical publishing, it takes a long time to get a paper in. MashaAllah. But this overturns essentially what was understood by history for a long time, right? And here is our next paper also on Balkhi, on phobias. And I just put in here the reviewer's comment, and the backstory on this topic was that it took months and months for them to come back with this, with any just even response to our submission. So we thought they had definitely rejected it. When they finally wrote back, they said, your paper was so unorthodox for our journal that we had to find historians of medicine to verify what on earth you were saying here. And they did. They finally found historians of, and this is a blinded, peer-reviewed process. And this is what the reviewers wrote back. If you can see they called me a his, but that's okay. Her exposition of this work overturns the most distinguished person, Barrios, who, by the way, I have to say something about Barrios, who really frustrated me, because some historians will write about Muslims and acknowledge their existence, and some don't even, right? Those who don't even, you could say maybe they just didn't think to look into our text, or everything is in a different language, they can't understand it, or you give them the 70 excuses, right? But this guy in particular specifically says, and then came after the Greeks and Romans, he talks about them for a while, then he talks about the Muslims and says, and the Muslims translated the works of the Greeks and Romans, but added nothing to their work onto the next population, right? A purposeful leaving out of what the Muslims actually did. And again, until we as Muslims understand and know our own heritage in this topic, and really in all the sciences, that's going to keep on happening over and over and over again. Just completely jumped over, right? So here, this kind of idea of overturning Barrios, of course it was a victory that day, mashallah, but really a victory for our ummah, and hopefully an inspiration for others to continue this kind of work, and really for you to understand what this means. And the implications really today is that you know that what's from the 9th century to the 19th century is a millennium difference. We're not talking a couple hundred years, we're talking a full millennium. So when our scholars have the inspiration from our deen to really see and understand things about the human being that only modern scholars with all of modern medicine can reach today, then you understand that there's something very special about the Islamic tradition, very holistic and wholesome in its tradition, to be able to come up with this kind of thing. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly end with a couple of slides here, and just say that there was also something very important about Islamic understandings of mental health, and what Muslims absolutely are attributed to is the moral treatment of and care of the mentally ill. There was no, as opposed to kind of the isolation, imprisonment, burning at the stake and such from other people. And you can see the ayah in the Quran that speaks to this idea that of entrusting, God has entrusted us, right, to help and feed and clothe, and to speak kindly. There is a lot of unkind speech related to the topic of mental illness in our day today, mashallah, but this goes absolutely against the exact wordings of the Quran itself. Also, understanding, like I mentioned before, the scholars, the books of the scholars that came before us, And knowing that it's not only our tradition, but also others that have come before us and talked about the importance of integrating spirituality into the mental health system and care. And Christian psychologists and psychiatrists have done extensive work on this topic before us, as have Jewish clinicians. So some of the key names like Koenig, who's one of my own mentors at Duke, and Pargament, who's Jewish, and other authors who have written extensively on what it means to have a faithful a person who practices a faith in the therapy room or in the diagnostic room, and how the clinician has to make sure that they are addressing their needs, right? And with that, I think it's a good place to kind of give a warm handoff to Brother Human, who will explain the Khalil Center's model, because that's exactly what we intend to do. Barakallah fikum, forgive me for any mistakes, but I hope inshallah this was eye-opening, and I think at the end of our panel we'll be taking questions inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.